The East Side was always a place that provided a sanctuary for all the offensive practices that St. Louis didn't want to deal with, St. Louis wanted to get rid of. So not only was it a place where you could pollute to your heart's desire, it was a place where you could go get a drink on a Sunday. And that's been a tradition on the East Side. It's been a zone of vice. It's been a zone of discard. It's been a nuisance zone.
In 1896, a terrible tornado roared through St. Louis, crossed the river, and cut through East St. Louis. Hundreds were killed, and there was widespread destruction. The very next day, the first establishment to rise from the wreckage on the East St. Louis riverfront was a saloon hammered together from the rubble. East St. Louis was well known for its taverns and its factories, but many of the factories were outside the city limits and didn't pay taxes. The taverns did.
Liquor stores made East St. Louis revenue work. Liquor licenses were very expensive. They had to be renewed quarterly, and they had to be paid a year or more in advance. About half of the city's budget came from saloon licenses in 1917.
This was a resilient part of the economy. After the big flood of 1903, many residents moved out of the hardest-hit area just outside downtown, and new businesses moved in. When the water went down, this would become known as the Valley, one of the Midwest's most famous red light districts.
Oh, Lord, yeah. And then when you went across the river on the bridge, you know, and looked out, and the women would all be lined up on the porch. Well, they were just whorehouses, that's all they were.
There was little fear of police crackdown. Plenty of cops and politicians and well-connected landlords were making money on all of this, and prohibition would make it even more profitable. It wasn't until World War II that there was a serious effort to clean up the valley. Nearby Scott Field had one of the highest rates of venereal disease of any base in the country, and the Army threatened to make East St. Louis completely off-limits to its airmen if something wasn't done. But enforcement was always a matter of degree in East St. Louis, and the valley disappeared in name only.
I grew up in that territory, shining shoes, running errands for the Vice girls. All I know is there was a lot of vice going on down there. There was a lot of nightclubs down there, and I mean, there was a lot of hustle and bustle down there at that time.
St. Louis had nightlife, but it also had closing times. So patrons and musicians would head to the east side where the drinks were served and the music played all day and all night. What made East St. Louis notorious would also make it famous in music history. There was live jazz and blues at countless clubs and taverns, and it was here at the Cosmopolitan Club on New Year's Eve of 1952 that Chuck Berry filled in for a sick member of the Sir John Trio, making this one of the legitimate birthplaces of rock and roll. The band was led by piano player Johnny Johnson. He had come to East St. Louis after the war looking for work, but not as a musician.
Then after I really got into music, that's when I really began to appreciate East St. Louis as a music town. I didn't really go there with the intention of making a name for myself as a musician. I went there to work, you know, a 9-to-5 thing.
Before he started making rock and roll records and going on tour, and sometimes even after, Johnny Johnson was like thousands of others, hard at work in the East Side factories, making bricks, glass, steel, chemicals. At one job at the Swift meatpacking plant, his musical career nearly came to an end.
One day I stuck the knife in the sheep's neck, and the knife hit a bone and ricocheted off the bone right through my thumb. And as I say, I didn't even know I was cut until when I got to the end where I would turn the sheep loose, I saw this thing dangling and looking at it with my thumb. all this is white meat up on there. It was did so quick it didn't have time to bleed before I seen it. And then naturally they rushed me over to Barnes Hospital and put me to sleep and sewed it back on.
The meatpacking houses employed thousands of people. Newcomers were given the worst jobs, carcass luggers and gut washers. People spent their whole working lives here, hard physical work in conditions that were too hot, too cold, and both at the same time.
And what, I don't give a damn how hard you work, you know, you might be sweaty, but you was cold, so. But it was tough. It was tough.
An Illinois guidebook called East St. Louis in 1939 lusty, smoky, and virile. Life in these factory towns was lived with a constant backdrop of smoke and grit from the industrial stacks and the locomotives, and with the sounds of steel on rails and the whistles of trains and factories. It didn't have the big city sophistication of St. Louis, Missouri, or the charm of the farm towns or county seats of southern Illinois. This was the American bottoms, and when the heavy rains came, the water flowed down from the bluffs and collected in the streets. It was said that's how Venice, Illinois, had gotten its name. And there were pockets here of extreme poverty. Down by the river was Carr Island, described by the guidebook as a squatter's settlement with 1,000 Negroes living in huts built from scraps. That's how the Lewis family lived during the Depression.
But you rent the ground for 50 cents a month. And you take any kind of wood you could get, car boxes and anything, and build you up a room on it. And see, we had a room there with no doors and windows. Oh, living in back then was rough. The housing condition was nasty.
Segregation was not the law in Illinois, but it was the practice in this part of the state, in schools and in factories, and in the neighborhoods of East St. Louis, and in Brooklyn, the oldest all-black town in Illinois. Despite the 1917 race riot, blacks had kept coming to East St. Louis to find work. The area's population increased in the middle part of the century, but since 1930 on, it was almost entirely due to the growing black population. And yet in the 1940s, East St. Louis was still more than 80% white. This was still a city of tight-knit white ethnic communities, still a city of old world accents, foods, and customs. But in other ways, especially after the war, younger East St. Louisans would grow up in a very different place than their parents and grandparents had come to. Things were as good as they had ever been, maybe as good as they would ever be.
And I don't think that period should be underestimated at all. It's, you know, that period from the 1930s to the 1950s is one in which people have viable incomes on a yearly basis for the first time.
The factories were still going and filled with workers, and now federal laws recognized their right to organize unions and negotiate contracts. And this tough factory town now became a tough union town.
To the point that by 1950, 80% of workers were organized in East St. Louis. It's probably the highest rate in the United States. And it might actually be one of the highest rates in the world.
Many East St. Louis natives would look back on these days nostalgically and wonder what happened. But it was already happening. East St. Louis was a place of aging factories and high labor costs, and companies were already looking for better places to do business. The biggest factories that had long defined East St. Louis, aluminum, the stockyards, meatpacking, foundries, they were cutting back in the 50s and shutting down and moving out in the 60s and 70s. It would happen in a lot of the industrial cities in what would come to be called America's Rust Belt.
but in East St. Louis, it's wild abandon. It's 50%, between 1950 and 1970, 50% of industrial jobs leave the city. It's an incredible statistic.
At the same time, East St. Louis would have to deal with the old issue of race relations. Blacks had kept coming to the city even though the jobs were starting to leave. The population was spilling over the old boundaries, and an increasingly aggressive civil rights movement was challenging the old rules and restrictions. In the late 50s, James Goss spent a couple of years in the Army, and he noticed the change when he came back home.
When I came back in 1959, things were beginning to change as far as location for blacks. They were coming out of Rush City. They were coming out of Franklin Bottom area where the Casino Queen sits at now. There was a little community down there. They were coming from Fireworks Station. I thought it was really something to go to the Majestic Theater because that was not allowed when I went into the military.
His family had been here since the Depression. His wife's family had come up from Mississippi before the First World War, about the same time the Chuznicka family had arrived from Poland. Some 60 years later, their descendants became next-door neighbors.
Almost overnight was the demise of those ethnic communities. My father, who couldn't really be accused of being liberal, went around the neighborhood and said, you know, I don't really see why we should move until at least we see these people, like maybe they're actually good neighbors.
I was a bit afraid to move into this neighborhood.
I wasn't. I wasn't scared because my parents and my grandparents, they were always proud people. And they had always taught us that you're not less than anybody, and you have the right to be anywhere that you can afford.
From some, there was open hostility towards the new Negro neighbors. Others gave them the silent treatment. And the white neighbors got together to talk about what they should do.
And the reason I knew that, I wasn't invited to the meetings, but John would tell me, about the meetings. And sometime he would tell me what they were planning and what they didn't want and what they were going to do. And we became very good friends. And I remember the day that he left here. He was the last Caucasian to leave the street.
East St. Louis had long been divided between black and white in its neighborhoods and schools and in its 2 new swimming pools. But it would soon be on its way to becoming an all-black city. Alvin Fields, who served 5 terms as mayor of East St. Louis, decided not to run for re-election in 1971. And that year, the race to replace him was between 2 black candidates. But in many ways, it would still be politics East St. Louis style. Fields had brought blacks into the political machine, and now it would be theirs.
I believe there was more an aspiration to be in the position, and there was a concomitant assumption that things would just continue to work the way they always have worked. And it was not until those seats were occupied that this new leadership began to realize they were ruling over very little.
East St. Louis in the 1970s was declining, but not into obscurity. In 1979, voters elected Carl Officer, at age 27, the youngest mayor in the country, leading one of the most depressed cities in the country. Newspapers and magazines and network television once again made East St. Louis a national story. But in many ways, it was an old story that raised the same baffling questions.
Why doesn't somebody do something about this? And what's sort of ironic is that every mayor in East St. Louis history was a reformer. Every mayor has come in saying, I'm going to make this city better than the mayor before me. There was one fellow who ran, Mayor Chamberlain, in 1915, who said, let's make East St. Louis a little more like home and a little less like hell.
This was one of the country's major industrial and rail centers, built by money, fuel, raw materials, technology, hard work. And yet with all that it had, even in 1920, the city of East St. Louis, Illinois was one of the poorest cities in the United States. And it continued to grow. By 1960, the year it was named an All-America City, the population was 80,000. City planners said it might grow to 100,000 in the next 20 years. But instead, it would fall until less than half the population remained. It would happen across the river in St. Louis and in other big industrial cities. But because of its separation and isolation, the coming urban problems would turn East St. Louis into an inner city with no outer city. Crime, poverty, corruption, pollution, none of that was new. It's just that East St. Louis had always gotten by because of the jobs. It was a place propped up by industries that had, as it turned out, just been passing through.
Aluminum ore, it was a period of 50 years. That's the life of that investment. This is a perfect example of something that's continuing to the present and is problematic for the whole world. The mobility of global capital, but the permanence of communities.
The reasons industry came here were the reasons they left. New sources of fuel, new technology, new sources of cheaper labor in other parts of the country and the world where unions hadn't taken hold, and transportation. Interstate highways and long-haul trucking freed industry from the railroads, and East St. Louis, the great rail terminus, became just another interchange.
It was certainly a boom town, and just as boom towns rise, they fall, and East St. Louis fell. And within the global economy, it has found no niche. It hasn't found anything to replace that industrialization.
Outsiders are struck by the decay and the abandonment. But it's been that way now for a generation, and those who live here tend to see other things. The remnants of the old healthy neighborhoods hanging on and fixing up. Even here and there, an all-new neighborhood. And in a town of boarded-up storefronts, a new place to go shopping. And in a town of empty factories, a new industry, an old industry really that is now legal and providing jobs, paying into the city treasury, and attracting visitors. Drops perhaps in a very large bucket, but drops nonetheless. And East St. Louis has always been a place filled with hope for the future, even while it is burdened by its past.
Made in USA is made possible by a grant from the estate of Nancy George, which reminds you to include public television in your will or trust.